Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Flow State podcast. I'm Stu. Today, I am very pleased to be joined by my good friend Jennifer Arnold, who is back with us. Welcome back, Jen.
Thank you, Stu. Glad to be back.
It is always a pleasure to have you on. And look, today we're going to continue our deep diving into the world of sales and talk about selling into government. But look, before we get into that, Jen, for people who perhaps have not listened to our previous episodes together or who are not familiar with you, give us a quick rundown of who you are, what are you focused on at the moment, why should people talk to you if they want to come and say hello?
Great. So my background is 30 odd years of working primarily in the technology industry. I've run sales and marketing teams across a lot of the big global brands you'd be familiar with, the IBMs, SAPs, Unisys for a number of years, and Squiz, which is an Australian-based software company. And a lot of that was selling into government, doing, kind of really big multi-million dollar deals around hardware and services and software. So I've got the battle scars from doing those, 18-month tenders and panel reviews and all of that good stuff. And so using that experience, I'm now working with an organization called Public Sector Network, which is an Australian-based global professional network for public sector professionals across a range of different roles. And we run events and training. And my role in that is actually to work with companies that want to sell to government to help to build their sales and marketing programs.
Awesome. Cool. That makes me feel like my intros are very poor because that was very concise and informative. Thanks, Jen. So look, that obviously leads us naturally into the conversation for today. And if you're in a rush, it's Friday, you might, and it's super nice down here, maybe you want to get to the beach. Obviously, the key things that we're going to be talking through today are the parallels and differences between selling into government, which is a unique beast in and of itself, versus what we're doing in private industry in B2B. And the common themes are obviously like there's a lot of diligence, there's a lot of complexity, there's a very heavy focus on ROI, more on that in the news in a moment. And critically, there's a very long buying cycle. So, the state of play in government to me, and I'm going to talk a bit about some recent news drama in a second, is that my experience of selling into government, I've done very limited government work in the UK and a little bit, I've been peripherally down here. I know people who are doing it like you, Jen. There seems to me to be a set of companies that are on the government books, they're the suppliers that they are. It takes ages to get onto, the approved list, and they're all just sort of doing a pretty bang average job, both back home and down here. And I could complain endlessly about that situation, but we won't because we're going to talk more positively today. And look, I know that's changing here in Australia because the current government's got a big sort of push to try and unlock, more opportunities for small business, which is great, personally and for the industry. But I just wanted to highlight a bit of news, which I think you've seen as well, Jen. So in case you are not, in case you've been under some sort of rock or you're not following the news, BOM, the Bureau of Meteorology, who hate the name that we all love, obviously have been in the news for not great reasons recently because they spent almost, what was it, like $100 million on a website redesign? Yeah. $96 million. Yeah. Now, if you want to read about the story and get into the details, I'll share the links. I don't want to go into it now, but there's three takeaways for me from this drama. Now, to be fair to the BOM, there is a lot of back-end work to do on their website, but to be also objectively realistic, they did screw all that up, right? Because there were loads of complaints about the basic functionality of the website post-redesign. So that was strike number one. Strike number two was massive delays and budget blowouts, which is just piss poor project management, poor scoping, probably both. And then the third was our, parasitic friends, the management consultants, who also managed to cream off a ton of money, Accenture and Deloitte specifically, and their budgets increased by something like 400% from the start of the project to the end. Now, this frustrates me because there's a lot of small and medium-sized businesses who can do much better jobs than have just been done there. And look, they can, as I said, you can read about the details, but that kind of leads me into the first question that I wanted to chat through with you, Jen, which is obviously when you're selling to government, like the government agenda, I assume drives a lot of their purchasing decisions, whether that's officially or sort of behind the scenes, from a what's on everyone's minds perspective. So what is on, the radar? Let's talk like federally across Australia, for example, Jen, like what is going to be driving their decisions? Like what's going to be on everyone's minds when they're in these procurement meetings? Obviously, like we're getting absolutely raked over the coals in the news is going to be on a few people's minds. But what else is on the agenda at the moment that might be impacting like actual sales decisions?
Yeah, it's and I want to come back to the bomb because I can understand how that went off the rails. And honestly, it's not too dissimilar to how I see private industry engagements like that go off the rails, right? Multi-year, probably lots of changes in scope, changes in teams. Obviously, a huge part of that spend was around cybersecurity testing, which makes sense because the government has come out and said the risks are higher than ever with that, and so they needed to make sure that was absolutely like rock solid from that perspective. So it was a necessary thing to be done. But I'll talk a little bit later about what's coming off the back of that, which is part of the trend, as you said, in kind of changing how they approach programs and who they use for them. But I also do want to say that I just sat at a New South Wales government event that we ran for the last couple of days where we had a couple thousand people from New South Wales government hearing about some of the amazing things that they're doing. So I just would like people to think, you do get these projects, but then you get like the digital birth certificate that came out from New South Wales government this year, which is like globally leading work that the New South Wales government is doing. So I don't want to tarnish all projects that people are doing within government because they are doing some fantastic stuff. But but as you said, like if you look at the macro trends, there aren't a lot of dissimilarities in terms of what are the big macro trends that are driving government decision making, government procurement areas. So when you look at things like the drive for productivity, we all know that over the past few years, Australia's productivity levels have dropped significantly, and that's something that government and private sector and universities are coming together to look at how do they address that issue and make Australian business, Australian government more productive. Aging and the demand for infrastructure, as there's not been a lot of investment in the infrastructure over the years. It's getting to a critical point. The obviously population growth that we've seen is putting a lot of pressure on infrastructure, from roads, et cetera, and also housing. And then you've got other major things like Queensland is obviously going through a major program of work around getting ready for the Olympics. That's driving a lot of infrastructure spend. Other population challenges, like the fact that the population is aging and what comes with that, is also healthcare demands, geopolitical risks that we're seeing too that impact our supply chains and other global market moves. So all of those impact government just as much as they impact private sector. And as I said, in a lot of these areas, it has to be government and private sector working together to address these challenges because you can't do it, just one or the other. And then, if you look at some of the other like more technology focused areas that's coming off, obviously AI, every event that we've been doing in the government sector is just AI top to bottom. Australia overall tends to be quite risk averse when it comes to these things and has been particularly risk averse in the AI space. So government has been taking like a slowly approach to that, making sure there are really good governance structures around it, taking into account all the ethical considerations. So they're doing it right, which is really good to see. And then, of course, cybersecurity, as we saw with the bomb thing, like every program of work just needs to have rock solid cybersecurity, because they're just under attack 24/7. And those are more headlines that you don't want to see that are around. It's bad enough that some of our biggest private brands are getting hacked and, being held to ransom and that sort of stuff. You definitely don't want to see that for a government department.
Yeah, and look, I actually, zooming in on the sort of the technology and software sectors there, like there's been another recent example there. I forgot to mention this to you actually before we spoke, where Twitter, or X, I guess we should grudgingly call it now, have just released a feature that shows you the location of, I think it's like the popular accounts. I don't think it shows you all of them, but people have been, unmasking all these agitation type accounts that generate a ton of traction and engagement. And are now realizing that they're not actually based in the countries that they primarily focused on, right? And there's a big discussion here about whether those are really, is this some nefarious, Illuminati style destabilization program, or is it just people in, typically like developing countries trying to make a quick dollar because they are gaming the attention economy, and that kind of rage baity stuff works. But look, I think that really, I'm glad that people in the Muggle world are starting to finally see that like things on the internet are not like necessarily how they seem, right? And like I know there's a bit of a boomer trope at the moment to be like, just believe everything you see on Facebook, but that happens everywhere. It's in every network. It's all over the place, right? And that is a massive area that the government should be investing in.
Yeah, I think, one, I think the government is very much looking at this fact. I mean, there was just the announcement today that they're in the process of redefining what terrorism means, because that definition has not been done since 9/11, so like nearly 25 years. To take into account, you see things like foreign nation states fomenting anti-Semitism in Australia just to create social discord that they can then take advantage of for different reasons, right? You see lots of election interference and those sort of things. So the fact is, it really is organized activity from kind of nation states trying to go into different countries that have democratic et cetera, different types of electoral systems and different types of social outlooks, and trying to create trouble and trying to destabilize. Yeah. So again, back to that cybersecurity, it's not something that can be overlooked. So, the government is taking steps in that way to strengthen our defenses, to find the people responsible for these, to counteract disinformation that's being distributed there. But then this is also partly with the social media ban for kids under 16, right? Because those are also the people like, young, impressionable minds are getting access, are being targeted by people who don't have their best intent in mind. And those kids are not able to make decisions on themselves. So, the Australian government's quite proactive in this and is leading the way in that social media ban, which is now I now see is being taken up by, is it South Korea, or there's another one, Singapore? There's another Asian country that now is modeling what they're doing off the back of what the
Yes, there is. Yeah, I forget which it is. Yeah, but look, I think look, I'm with you, and I think to be fair and present both views, I do think the government broadly is doing a lot of good work, but like you said, it doesn't often get celebrated as much, should we say? But look, in terms of pulling that back to sort of their priorities and how that relates to, I guess, how we, how we can be pitching ourselves to them. Like if you're in one of those businesses who is either trying to sell into government, or if you're in private industry and you want to understand like what the kind of diligence required around government can teach you in order for you to sell better into private industry, like what's your view on what the sort of current priorities are from a procurement perspective, and how do we, in the world of B2B, whether we're looking at government or not, like take those priorities and sort of apply them to what we're doing right now?
Yeah, so there are, I mean, as you said at the start, this is, essentially a B2B enterprise environment for the most part, right? So all of those things that you get with it around long deal cycles and, kind of hopefully stringent procurement processes you get with this. So if you look at what the similarities are, public and private are both equally focused on seeing ROI and seeing value for money, making sure that standards and metrics are being built into their tender requirements to be able to accurately measure what they're getting back for their investment. Both want to buy from known and trusted brands that have proven delivery capabilities. So they want to see case studies. They want to have references. They want to, don't always necessarily want to be the first one out trying something new. They want to have some proof that it's going to work. And, again, it's a very typical buying cycle where it takes a while. They do a lot of research, and we know in the B2B space that quite often they will not come to you, or when they do come to you, they almost have a short list in mind, right? They do a lot of groundwork to go out and look at what's available in the market, who's done what, etc. So it's a very similar sort of thing. So you need to make yourself known to that buying committee well ahead of time to make sure you get onto those short lists, right? Now, where you see the difference with that is again, that buying committee, there can be extra steps, like there are government panels, and unless you have gotten onto one of those government panels and had all of the, kind of basically it's almost like a pre-checklist, they can't procure from you. You have to go through that initial step. Right. And there's some that are just really basic ones. Just, I'm registered as a company and the government can procure for me. But then you do get into the government has very specific cybersecurity panels, where they go in and they pre-qualify people, and then they can only buy from that pre-qualified list. So there's kind of another step involved. In terms of business drivers, the other thing that you see, obviously the government's not focused on profitability. They're more focused on cost efficiency because they're working with your tax dollars. So it's not like we're going to help you grow, we're going to make you more profitable. That's not what the government is. That's not the message that's going to resonate with them. They want to know that about cost efficiency. They want to know about jobs creation in their local market. So if you're tendering for business in Victoria, Vic government's going to want to know, that's great. How much are you going to grow, the economy and grow jobs creation in this state, right? How much are you going to contribute to innovation and prove value back into the local market? So those are things that are a little bit different. And as I said, much more heavily compliance related. The procurement process you go through is much more stringent than you would find, except maybe in financial services, like another regulated type of environment. But they want to have a lot of transparency of process and decision making, but they're very clear rules and probity guidelines that you need to follow.
I think you've touched on a few quite interesting nuances there, Jen, but I think it'd be good to sort of dig into a bit because I'm totally with you on that. I think like one of the fun things about procurement, which is not necessarily a sentence that I would have assumed I would be saying this year, is that it's the great leveler in terms of like who can apply for what, right? So like what I enjoy about procurement, being a relatively analytically minded person, is like there's a checklist of stuff and you either meet the criteria or you don't. Like that immediately is, you sort of know what you're up against there, which is great. So if you pass the first hurdle, wonderful. But when you go beyond that, and obviously this is an area that we spend a lot of time in terms of your messaging to your buyer group and like buyer group intelligence and really understanding what is the intent behind these decisions. That point you made about the different focus on ROI is a really interesting one between government and private industry, because obviously ROI is ROI. It's like what you're getting back for your investment, right? But that point you just made about if you're pitching to government, it's all about cost efficiency or cost benefit, right? Because they're spending our money, it's like taxpayer money that's getting spent, right? So that lens is super important. And I think where a lot of people unintentionally get things wrong is understanding those kinds of nuances in terms of the primary requirement and driver of the thinking. Whereas, as you noted, in private industry, you typically will be like acquisition oriented, growth oriented, and then the knock-on implications are interesting, right? Because we deal with a lot of, to give a stark two ends of the spectrum example, a lot of the clients we work with are enterprise, right? So their approach, very similar to government, is like slow and steady. We don't want to make any wild changes. We just sort of keep things ticking over. It's all about like incremental growth and incremental improvements, which is fine for them. Whereas if you're coming back down to my end of the spectrum, small business, they're all like much more focused on like either rapid fire growth or, acquisition and evolution of the business, or like, something a lot more sort of short term focus and sort of not ambitious necessarily, but like just typically more focused on that, like how do we get from here to here, whereas your enterprise businesses are like, we are here, we want to stay here, and the decisions we make now are going to bear fruit 5 years down the line or whatever. So I think that line of
unless
thinking is
there's a
really
really
important.
pressing challenge, right? So, like,
Yeah,
I have
yeah,
never seen government move faster than when COVID hit and they realized they
yeah,
needed to
yeah,
really quickly, and at that point in time, I was working for a company that built websites, right? So for
yeah,
state and local government websites, and so they had already been on a path of becoming more citizen focused, putting more digital services in place, but they thought they had more time, right? And there wasn't a real sense of super urgency behind it. And
yeah,
most of what was driving that was cost reduction, was the fact that people are like, I can do this sort of thing with my bank online. Why can't I do this with the government online, right? So
yeah, yeah,
it was like a
yeah,
groundswell, bottom up type of approach. All of a sudden, COVID hits, and pretty much every government service had to be put online quickly. And so, it was so sometimes things happen where there's a super amount of pressure and the government can move quickly if it wants. But what that is totally based on is having the social license to do it. Right. And that is
yeah,
always at the back of their minds. Right. And that's why they take a very cautious approach, because they realize if they lose the public trust, they lose that social license to do things like, I will give you information about myself to have a digital identity in any way, shape, or form. I trust the
yeah,
government enough to apply for this critical service online rather than go into a service center and see somebody face to face. Right.
yeah,
So that's a lot of what drives the slow and cautious approach. And you also see, like I said, with AI, they've been very cautious around that. And that's a lot of that, but the federal government is coming out of that robo-debt situation, which was
yeah,
not an AI solution, but it was a technology underpinned solution, right? But it was lack of
exactly.
human oversight for some of the decision makings. And with AI, that is what they're absolutely focused on, is like, yes, we will use it to do some of these things, but human oversight is built in at every step of the way.
Yeah, and look, I think that's a really important point where, and you and I have spoken about this before, and I've talked about it quite endlessly on on these shows. Is like the key to the way that we're obviously designing our new business and the way that Flowsafe works. And I think what a lot of people in particularly the software industry tend to forget is like there are people on the other side of all these computers and phones, and like obviously being a digital guy for a long time, like I am guilty of doing this as well. Like used to do a lot of work in e-commerce, which is obviously hardcore stats focused. You just like, and obviously it's Black Friday / cyber forever sales at the moment. So you're like, how many of these numbers can I get to go up? How many can go down? Like it doesn't even matter if there's people on the other end. Whereas, what I enjoy about B2B and the government is that you do have that bigger picture view that forces you to remember that yes, we're not spending our own money and we're not, necessarily selling super exciting things on paper, but they actually are super exciting because they solve much bigger problems. And the reason that they're more exciting and, and have that bigger impact is because of all the reasons you just said, right? It's like we're doing like what I would say is much bigger, more important work. And people are understandably cautious about making those decisions because your career might rest on, especially your government. You screw something up as a minister, all it takes is a bad news cycle and you're out of a job like the next
But
month.
I mean,
Right?
some of this stuff is literally life or death, like literally. If
Yeah,
it comes to healthcare, aged care, emergency services, these transportation, like a lot of these things, are people actually going to get paid this month, paid their benefits this month, and so that they can put food on the table? These are like really, really critical services, and they're servicing a customer base bigger than pretty much any company that you'd find. So
yeah,
me as a
yeah,
taxpayer, me as a user of government services, I'm more than happy for them to be cautious about the approach and take their time to make sure that they get it right. And they're not going to get it right 100% of the time, because as you said, there are people on the other end of these things who are
yeah,
not faultless all the time and maybe don't make the right decisions. But when you hear the government speak, when you hear ministers speak, so like we had Minister Dean speak at the event this week, and he's the he's got many titles: Minister for Emergency Services, Minister for Customer Service. He holds a couple of ministerial hats. The first thing that he talks about is inclusion, He said, we do not want to leave anybody behind if they, if they don't live in the city, if they don't have great digital skills, maybe they have non-English background.
Yeah.
And he said, first and foremost, we have to bring everyone on this journey and we have to service everyone. So again, they take the time to say, yeah, we could probably whack this out there and maybe it would suit 80% of the population, but they're not going to do it until they also know that other 20% is covered, which is, again, is something that private sector organization doesn't always need to take into account.
Yes. And look, I think, going slightly off piste before I sort of move on to our next question here, I think that sticking with that whole there's people on the other end of this stuff consideration, I think we've seen a few examples where, and I'll give you two recent ones, on COVID, where things have not been at an exemplary level. So in the UK, there was a huge drama because the government did have to move super fast. Sorry, it's my dog's going crazy. The government did have to move super fast. They had to get a load of stuff live really quickly. But then in the UK, we saw all the old boys and their little mates from Eton in their VIP lane setting up companies to bring in PPE because, so Joffrey knows Jonty and, they used to go summer together. And there was a pretty disgusting side of essentially just, rich people robbing all of the taxpayers to make loads of money. And the biggest example of this was, I don't know if people are familiar with her down here, but Michelle Mone, who is in the House of Lords and is like a baroness or something, completely undeservedly. Her and her husband set up a PPE company, flogged a load of it to the government. It's all useless, basically. I think something like 70 or 80% of it couldn't be used. They made a fortune. They obviously, all their affairs are offshore, so they pay hardly any tax. Bought a yacht with the profits. They're being investigated now. They're supposed to be paying it back. But there were so many examples of this where the government was essentially taken advantage of because, people in private industry are bastards and they don't care that they're ripping off the working people. So I guess that is a bad example of how things can sometimes go wrong when the government rushes is important because it just validates everything you were saying about being cautious, right? The second
and the
example
social
I think
license,
you made,
right? That's broken trust.
Yes, exactly, yeah.
So why would we trust
totally.
this person to make bigger decisions if they, make such poor decisions in that area?
And look, interestingly, that all stemmed from the fact that there was too much blending of, there's a lot of chat of, too much private industry in government because a lot of the ministers at the time had come from private industry roles, as they often do. But, there was a bit too much sort of blurring of the lines there, I think, which is what contributed partly to that situation. But where I was leading with that rambling story was we also had down here as well, there's a lot of, sort of challenging of the digital narrative in government, exactly as you've said, because I'm a lot more sympathetic to this view now that I'm dealing with, sort of older relatives and stuff as well, where obviously we're all pushing for digital as the primary medium through which everything happens. But, what if you actually don't have a smartphone? What if you don't want a smartphone? What if you don't want to do everything on the internet? As you said, the government still needs to serve all those use cases.
That's right.
So as digital people, when we're thinking about pitching to government and when we're thinking about huge buyer groups and how we sort of build a narrative around how businesses speak to that, how do we deal with that and how do you create that sort of credibility and, address that if you are purely software or technology focused?
I think it's about enabling, so as an example, most of the AI work that has been happening in government has been on the back end, right? So you've not seen a lot of agentic AI, so agents, AI-based agents going out as being the front point of citizen services, right? They're holding off on that until they're confident they can do that right. But a lot of the back end stuff has been about the kind of the data usage. So obviously, government has huge amounts of data that they've been working very hard in the lead up to this to make sure that's surfaceable and usable and accurate. But if you were to pick up the phone and call a government call center, they've been building AI into the call center tools that will then pull up the necessary data for them to give you an answer quickly and accurately and service you faster. So a lot of what the AI usage has been around has been how do we also enable these other channels? And, whether it's be somebody sitting, being in a New South Wales service center when you walk in to renew your license or, deal with your Centrelink payments or something like that, the tools that the employees are using are being improved and making them more productive and allowing them to give better citizen services as well. Similarly, if you look at hospitals, kind of lots of programs of work around giving doctors and administrators and nurses better access to tools that allow them to give better patient care. A huge amount of work around enabling teachers and taking all of the admin work, or as much of the admin work, off of teachers as they can, and streamlining some of that like busy work that teachers have to do in that admin work so that they can spend more time with students. So, it's all of that stuff where, yes, it's great to put up a beautiful website or a new app or something like that, but it's actually the back end that's going to have the greatest impact across the board.
Yeah. Yeah, look, I mean, that's obviously an area that you and I spend a lot of time in, Jen, like not in the way that probably sounds, but, the back end of stuff is where a lot of our clients are working, right? like back end technologies, data technology, connecting stuff, like making it work more efficiently. Yeah. And look, I feel like we're going to have to do a part 2 of this conversation because I know we said we were going to try and stick to half an hour. So let me ask you 2 more questions to sort of round this one off, and then I feel like we'll have to come back and dig into this again to finish this off. So bearing everything you just said in mind, or we've just discussed in mind, right? You're a marketer, you're trying to sell into government, you know that you're going to be dealing with like a large group of people that are all, with probably fairly diverse sort of remits and agendas. Like, how should you be thinking about starting to build your strategy to pitch something to government? And look, if you want to pick a specific industry area, if that's easier, like that might be helpful. But like, what are the sort of top 3 to 5 fundamental starting points that you are really critical for just getting the right approach in place before you start doing stuff?
Yeah, again, some of this stuff is not too dissimilar. Like the fundamentals of selling to government versus selling to business, there are a lot of similarities there. I think, one, again, you need to understand their business, right? And you need to understand their audiences. Who are the people they're serving? Who are the people that they're delivering value to, and what does value look like for them? And know your customer, essentially. Know what they do, know what drives them, know their motivations. Because again, it's totally different. It's not about profit building. It's not about bringing more revenue in. It's actually about value building. So understanding the drivers and building your value propositions to the government body around that. I think also know who the decision committee is. So who is actually making the decision? One of the problems I see quite often is a private like a company who's sold into private organizations wants to sell into public, and they think they should start at the minister, right? Okay, if I go in and I speak to the minister, that minister is going to guide my way through this. And like, no, the minister, 9 times out of 10 is taking a purposeful step back from the procurement discussion, right? And they will just they'll listen to you, but then they will fob you off. They'll push you down like, that's not me. That's,
they will delegate effectively is what we're saying, Jen, right?
Yeah. So, who's making the decisions? Who are your stakeholders, and how do decisions get made? And decisions in government, like in private sector, there are changes, there are ebbs and flows through obviously budget cycles highly impact how decisions are made. You see machinery of government changes. So, if the government goes from labor to liberal or otherwise, quite often they combine departments, split out departments, like things change, roles and responsibilities change. So you need to be aware of that because that can change who your stakeholders are and how things are approved. You need to look at the broader environment. You need to understand, because as I said, they're risk averse. The main thing they want is not to be in the newspaper for the wrong reasons. Right. Yeah. So if there is something happening in the greater environment that is, going to impact that will become very much part of their decision-making process. So those are things to think about. And there are also different stakeholders sometimes that you need to consider. So quite often they do have, the big consulting firms like the Deloittes, the PwCs, the KPMGs, et cetera, in there. helping to define programs of work, etc. So there's a whole other like external set of influencers and decision makers that you would need to take into account. And sourcing consultants to like the ISGs and the Minter Ellisons, who sometimes will run an entire procurement process and be, almost keep you at an arm's length. There'll be a filter through that. Yeah. So, they get involved in like mining companies, banks, etc. They're in those really big deals. But if you've been selling into like mid-tier private sector companies, you might not have come across those sort of stakeholders before. So it's a whole other level of, kind of looking at intent signals, again, might come through them, not through the government themselves. And they've got a different view on the value that they're looking for. So that buying committee might be a little bit more extensive than what you might be used to.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's a really interesting point, because you're almost looking at a committee of committees, right, aren't you? Because you've got several groups of people with quite different agendas, that you need to kind of work around there, which is an interesting, sort of next level from where we're normally at. Because even though we might still be dealing with quite big buyer groups in private industry, like you're never going to get like, you might have like your 10 or 15 people in government, but then you might have, 5 or 10 from Accenture, you might have 5 or 10 from some rando procurement business, right? Like that definitely adds a layer of complexity, I think. So I guess what we're saying there is just spend your time doing your due diligence, right? And like that is where, obviously, as we've banged on a lot about, like your buyer group intelligence becomes like super important. Like if you're dealing with several different groups or committees and understanding their relationships as well as your relationship and what you're trying to pitch.
And don't think it's going to be a fast process either. If you're deciding, deciding now you want to sell to government, there are steps around getting on panels, getting potentially certain security certifications or technology certifications. Sometimes there can be requirements around where your delivery team is based, where your data is going to be based as part of the project, right? So all of those things need to be taken into consideration before you even start thinking about selling to government. So this is not a like a hit and run situation. Oh, I'll just do some government work for a bit because the private sector is a bit quiet. It's a long-term commitment to building a team, building the delivery capabilities, building a brand, building the trust, building relationships. So you're either in it or you're out of it. It's not I'll dabble in government. It needs to be a commitment.
And look, I think that diligence is super important when you're, if you're running your own business or you're involved in business strategy. Like I think, obviously when things are a bit tougher, and COVID was a great example of that. You do see a lot of like flip flopping, and like I think there's a difference between that's sometimes lost between, being sort of agile and reacting to things where you need to versus just panicking and flapping around, right, and just losing faith in your own strategic approach to your market, right? So like, I guess if you're in the government boat already, it's great to have that discipline, because it will be like a multi-year, thing if you're just starting out, right? Like, we have this problem where like Flow State isn't big enough to get onto some tenders. We have to go through other bigger businesses, which is part of the approach based on the nature of our company. We might not ever be big enough because we might not want to be big enough, right? So like,
which is a very valid approach. Yeah, absolutely. We see that happen with lots, and we actually recommend that to a lot of companies to say, we want to sell into defense. It's like, oh, okay, you're going to start with defense? Really?
Yeah. The hardest of the ones to get into, right?
But if you can build a partnership, if your solution aligns well with another company's solution that already is all of those, on all of those government panels, they already have the certifications, then maybe they can, then you get like a sub-prime. They can be the prime in the contract, and you can just subcontract to them. And then, kind of build some credibility, build some skills until you're either ready to go on your own, or having that channel-based, partner-based approach sometimes is 100% valid forever for the company, depending on what their niche is.
Yeah, and look, like I've obviously worked in that world during my time at GroupM and WPP, where you would effectively just act as the master agency, as they used to call it back in the old days. But that as you said, that approach is totally fine. I think if you're confused about what we're talking about now, like from a simple perspective, as you just said, Jen, this is just like affiliate style channel sales, partner sales. Like that's the strategic framework that you need to make this approach. You need to see who's on government rosters or government radars, or who can pitch for stuff and do RFPs, and then you need to pitch yourself to them, right? So like again, that you still need to be aware of your end customer, the government, right? But then you got your new customer becomes, you know, like we've done stuff like this with Media Monks, for example, and a few of the bigger agencies where, you know, we're then like, we do this, here's how we fit in, you know. It's a pretty functional conversation because you're typically speaking to people who get where you're at, and like you can skip over a lot of the groundwork stuff and just be like, look, here we are, here's what we do, here's our terms, can we work with you guys? It's actually like a really productive way to investigate how feasible that is, I think. Let's just keeping an eye on time, Jen, in my new mission, just in time for the end of the year to be more diligent about those sorts of things. Let me just ask you one final question, and then I think let's tee up around 2 of this discussion, because I've got like another 4 or 5 questions that I don't think we talked about this time. So, given that we are approaching the end of 2025, which is now looming on the horizon, you mentioned a couple of timing-oriented triggers earlier. You know, changes in government, the budget. You know, like what are the main timing considerations for if I'm selling to government right now? It's the end of the calendar year. What is coming up in 2026? What timing considerations are there? Like, you know, what's going to be like a good time or a bad time to actually start doing something and think about, you know, putting the wheels in motion?
Yeah. So what we're going to see is over in the next few weeks, usually it's around mid-December standpoint, we see their first half budget review. So it basically says, how are the first 6 months of the financial year gone? How much of our budget has been sent? Where do we need to, you know, tweak things a little bit? They'll be holding off on, you know, kind of making some commitments until they know where they stand for that. So coming into the new year, we'll see another round of kind of procurement activity starting to pick up when they know where their budget stands for the second half of the year. Depending on the market, Victoria has been a bit slow at the beginning of the year. They've had a review going on down there. It's called the Silver Review, that potentially has a whole bunch of job losses involved in it. So they've been waiting to pull the trigger on some things until they get a report back from that. But hopefully that will be coming soon. So if anybody's selling into Vic, hopefully the second half of the financial year will be a bit clearer in terms of what's happening. The budgeting cycle for FY 26-27 will kick off probably after the Easter time period. They'll start planning for next year. So it's a good time to kind of start thinking about what's going to happen. Start building. You can never start building relationships too soon. But if you start looking at, you know, kind of getting their thinking going around where they should be focused for the next financial year, where budget should go, that's something to consider. If you're already in with government, one of the things to also consider, if you've got a relationship in some of the big agencies, et cetera, they're not too dissimilar from big corporates where they have like use it or lose it budgets. If they find themselves in the last couple of months of the year and they're like, oh, we have all this money that we haven't spent. I mean, it's a nice situation for them to be in, but they'll be looking for ways to spend that money. So it's worth having a conversation with the client about, you got anything left over that you want to pull forward or you want to add to something that's already happening. We've got some elections happening as well. So the Vic election is in, I think, November next year, which means November, October, anyway, second half of next year. They go basically in the couple of months, as soon as an election is called, pretty much all procurement discussions stop. So that's the other thing for people to keep in mind in the lead up to the hard stop, right? Election. Yeah, exactly. They can engage in discussions. You know, there can be some informals, but there's nothing concrete in terms of where budget's going to be spent or anything like that. So that's just something from the sales cycle perspective to keep on your radar. But, you know, kind of the big one will be when budgets are released kind of early in the new financial year. That, again, you'll see another big uptick. People will have been planning projects and now the budgets have come through and they'll start kicking off.
Nice. Well, look, that's really clear. I guess at least you've got a fairly specific cycle and some clarity around when to do stuff, right, with the government that you often lack in
but the main thing
industry,
is, like, just don't wait. Like from a relationship building, brand building, like once you get your value props in order, et cetera, start looking to build relationships, because it's like B2B. Like just because you're ready to sell doesn't mean they're ready to buy. You know, it may be they won't be ready to buy for another 12 months, but again, they're doing all of that research in the next 12 months. And so you need to get on the radar screens as quickly as possible.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And look, I think that's a great point to round off on for part one, Jen, which is exactly like, you know, just get going and trust the process. I think is like, you know, just consistency and sticking with your end goal is the key thing, right? Like just don't lose faith halfway through and be like, no,
and get your ducks in a row. Get your ducks in a row for what you know you're going to need to get onto panels, to be able to meet certifications or whatever. Yeah.
I like that. Just sticking with the P's, right? Was it 5 P's, 7 P's? Yeah, awesome. Well, look, I think let's definitely come back, Jen. I'll send you some options to get back on to continue this discussion, because there's a load more stuff it'd be great to dig into. But look, thanks for joining me again. I think that was super interesting. And it's given me a few thare think about actually now in advance of next year. So if people do want to get in touch with you, Jen, like what's the best way for them to contact you? What are your plans through to the end of the year?
Well, I would say the best thing, when we're talking government specific stuff, is the work that I do through the Public Sector Network. So if you go onto the publicsectornetwork.com site, you'll be able to see, I cover the area called vendor advisory services. You'll be able to see that, and they can put an inquiry through, or they want to just shoot me an email to, it's jennifer.arnold@publicsectornetwork.com. And happy to have a chat, or LinkedIn is always a good place to.
Awesome.
Yeah.
The go-to, LinkedIn. Like it. Awesome. Well, look, that was very interesting, Jen. Thank you once again for coming back on. And if you do want to get in touch with Jen, that's how to do it. So yeah, let's get back together and do part 2, Jen. But thank you once again.
No, my pleasure. Thank you for having me again.
It's a pleasure, Jen. I still don't have a good ending, so this is the end, everyone.